Okay, hello and welcome everybody to today's CRCC seminar series event. We're very excited to have with us Professor Lasse Thomassen, who's a professor of politics at Queen Mary University of London, and he will be talking with us today about deconstructing sovereignty discourse in a time of COVID-19.
So I'm gonna use this opportunity to talk about sovereignty or sovereignty discourse. And this is part of this talk is part of a book project on Jacques Derrida and deconstruction as method for political theory, a book project that I'm writing on at the moment, which of course considers what does deconstruction as a method mean at all, in particular in political theory, which is my subdiscipline. So the book is about that, what it means to use deconstruction as a method in political theory. And then I use four concepts, engage with four concepts or practices, you could also call them, but first of all, they are concepts, which are rights, sovereignty, democracy, and populism. So what I'm going to present to you is a small part of a very long chapter on sovereignty. I'm going to show you some slides. Most of them are just quotes. I won't read through the quotes with a couple of exceptions. So I've just put some quotes in there to support what I'm saying. Okay, so coronavirus, COVID-19 once again. So during this pandemic for the last year and a bit, critique of government restrictions and government measures has mainly come from the right, from right-wing populists and from right-wing libertarians, and sometimes there's an overlap between the two. And perhaps the US is the best example of this, but I think we can also see it in Brazil and in India, and also in the UK, as well as in many other places. The critique is usually made in the name of individual freedom against what the critics see as state oppression or even dictatorship or tyranny. Meanwhile, on the left has been very little critical and has generally been supportive of government restrictions. And of course, this is not that surprising, given that at least on part of the left, there's a view of the state as the benevolent facilitator of freedom. And we find this again here in arguments and debates about how to respond to the pandemic. There are exceptions, of course, and on the left, Giorgio Agamben, he stands out for his stance that the government response to the crisis in Italy specifically, but more generally, is the latest instance of the totalization of the sovereignty of the modern state, over and against, in opposition, always in opposition to the freedom of the citizens. And he has written about this in various pieces, written mainly during 2020, from the very beginning in February until more recently. And they are now being published next week in a small book. They've been collected into this small book called Where Are We Now, in English. It's already been published in Italian and Spanish. The result for him, for Agamben, is that freedom is willingly traded for safety, and Agamben laments the complicity of the left in this, and this is something important to me. So I just want to go through the bottom quote here on the slide, because he writes there that it was possible. He's talking about here the first months of the pandemic in Italy. He says it was possible to see the paradox of organizations of the left, and these organizations could be political parties, but also unions, political movements, and so on. But organizations of the left, traditionally in the habit of claiming rights against the state, claiming rights for citizens, and denouncing violations of the Constitution, now accepting limitations on liberty. and not only accepting these limitations on liberty, but limitations that are made by ministerial decree, that is, decisions that have been made and put on our freedoms, not through the usual parliamentary procedures, but by decree, as we've seen in many other countries. Devoid of any, he continues, devoid of any legal basis, and which even fascism couldn't dream of imposing. I think Agamben is wrong, but I also think that we need to take what he here calls the paradox. We need to take that seriously. And for me, the question here is whether there's a way to approach sovereignty or the exercise of sovereignty critically from the left, or something like the left, or from a progressive perspective. So not from a perspective which is of the right, which starts from a certain idea of the individual and of the relationship between the individual and state, but from a different perspective. So in this presentation, I'm gonna pit Jacques Derrida against Agamben. And my focus is on how we respond to sovereignty. Obviously, Derrida didn't have anything to say about COVID-19, but he did engage with the concept and the practice of sovereignty in several works during the last years of his life. Most of all, the book called Rogues, and then the seminar series, The Beast and the Sovereign, which has been turned into a 2-volume book. Now, Derrida is critical of discourses of sovereignty, but at the same time, he shows sovereignty to be a general problematic and to be always conditional and never total. And in both these senses, his position differs from that of Agamben, and that is why both Agamben and Derrida are interesting for me here. And this allows Derrida to question the opposition that Agamben works with, the opposition between freedom and sovereignty. I will come back to how Derrida unfolds this deconstruction of sovereignty discourse. For the moment, suffice it to say that he shows the opposition to be this opposition between sovereignty and freedom. He shows that to be more complex than Agamben allows for. Instead of a hierarchical, conceptual opposition, which is also a normative opposition or hierarchy in Agamben between sovereignty and freedom, instead of that, Derrida proposes what we could call a kind of differentiation within, but also between concepts such as sovereignty and freedom. So we get different sovereignties and different freedoms, as well as he also talks about unconditionality and reason and democracy in this context. But I will focus on sovereignty and freedom here. Before I get to more Agamben and Derrida, I would like to put something else on the table at the same time. Of course, we all have many examples of what has been going on during this past year, examples that are in different ways connected to sovereignty. I have spent the last almost 2 years in Copenhagen in Denmark, where I'm based at the moment. So I've been living through the pandemic here in Denmark. The last time I was in the UK was on the 10th of March 2020 on a one-day trip to London, which was a bit crazy at the time, but I didn't think about it. But in hindsight, it was really crazy to go at all. Anyway, I want to bring this case of Denmark onto the table here because there's a sense in which it's a kind of that Denmark and the Nordic countries more generally are usually taken as a kind of beam of reason, of a place where things are good, things are stable, things are safe, and I've also seen this during the pandemic. Less so Sweden than Denmark and Norway, but certainly in the case of Denmark. And this is how people have spoken about Denmark, both within Denmark, but also from the outside. And I think that this makes it interesting for me. It's as if Denmark has been this example again of a kind of a good exercise of sovereignty, of state sovereignty, a benevolent exercise of sovereignty. And I don't mean this to be good or bad. I'm not interested in that for the moment. But I just note that this is how it's often considered. The whole thing for the last year and a bit has also been very consensual here in Denmark, in terms of consensus around what needed to be done, the restrictions put in place, and how the state should exercise its power, and what we as citizens ought to do. That consensus has slightly broken up now since about Christmas, and mostly in relation to the reopening. Okay, so I would like to highlight 4 points in this. Okay, first the opposition between the executive, so the government, and parliament. So insofar as there has been opposition to what the government has been doing, it has been articulated in terms of this kind of executive versus parliament, and more specifically as an opposition between something like the state or government, and on the other side democracy. And the case has been that the government has basically been running the show and has been informing parliament but not really involving parliament until very recently, because they didn't have to. They've just been running over parliament. It's the opposition here, or the tension between executive and parliament, had also been articulated in terms of sort of authoritarianism, authoritarian government, as opposed to individual freedom. But this critique, it has almost always come from the right, from a liberal right and a conservative right, and from a right-wing populist, more extreme right. It hasn't come from the left. In fact, the left, the parties to the left and organizations to the left of the current social democratic government, if anything, they have been asking for more restrictions, for more exercise of state sovereignty. So that's interesting in itself. Also here, I'd like to point out that this appeal to, when we have the critique of the government, the appeal to democracy is also an appeal to a certain kind of sovereignty, namely to popular sovereignty. And the appeal to individual freedom is also an appeal to some kind of sovereignty, the sovereignty, the freedom, the liberty of the individual. Next, the Danish state is a relatively strong state. And you see that in the way in which they use ID numbers here in Denmark, and the way in which the health system works, and so on. And apart from that, there's no strong territorial division, as opposed to, for instance, the case of the US, where you've got the division between the federal level and the states, and also sub-state levels of government. We have a bit the same in Spain with the tensions between the central government and the regions about who gets to decide what we can do and what we cannot do, especially in relation to health policy. And in the case of Italy, you got something slightly different, because you got, in effect, you got a weaker state who's suffering a sort of legitimacy deficit, and that may have been partly the explanation for how the Italian government and the state reacted in the beginning. But my main point here is that in the case of Denmark, state sovereignty, and not just as formal law, but in all sorts of ways, state sovereignty permeates society. In the way that society is run, it's extremely difficult to avoid to live outside of the state in any sort of way here. And then third, from the government, but really from all sorts of people and across the political spectrum, we have had all these appeals to a sense of community, to a sense of a shared community. So all these appeals to a we, where the government talks about we Danish and so on, and where we are supposed to be in the same boat. So this is these appeals to a shared community of the Danish people, and this is also, I think, also a way in which sovereignty is shored up by the government and by the state and by other agents as well. But it also means that sovereignty here, state sovereignty specifically, cannot. First of all, it's not something that can be detached from society, and secondly, this state sovereignty is intimately connected to a sense of homogeneity. And of course, this is sort of homogeneity that ultimately becomes articulated in terms of the nation, of certain nationalism. And finally, then the tension or the relationship between politics and science, or political decisions and science. So here in Denmark, we have had a case of the government, the state, but really the government, legitimizing their decisions, political decisions, with reference to science. We have to put in these restrictions because the scientists tell us that so and so, and if we don't do that, the numbers will rise, etc., etc. And of course, at the same time, the government took the credit when things went well. But what I think is interesting here is that this relationship between politics and science, or political decisions and science, this can be articulated in a number of ways. So in the US, you had at least some part of the discourse around COVID-19. There was a strong opposition between politics and science, so kind of personified by Trump versus Fauci. But that was not the case in Denmark. It was not articulated as this kind of opposition, and everybody was appealing to science at some level. Now, what that raises for me is a question about the relationship between, on the one hand, sovereignty or the state and government, and on the other hand, it could be science, but it could also be more broadly something like reason. It could also be the university. So if we talk about sovereignty on the side of the state, what are we talking about when we talk about the independence of science and the independence of reason, the independence of the university from, among other things, from the state? Are we then not also talking about a certain kind of sovereignty? Okay. I maybe I should note that I tend to identify with this description of Denmark as a safe space, almost as a safe haven, with this sense of being in good hands. This sense that the government and the state, they know what they're doing, so we don't have to be afraid. But I think that's actually even more reason to take Agamben's paradox seriously, right? To ask critical questions about this relationship that some of us on the left have to what the state does, and what the way in which state sovereignty is exercised. For instance, in this case of COVID-19. So now I'm going to return to Agamben and then turn to Derrida. My aim is not to provide answers to some of the questions I have raised now, but it's rather to raise a number of questions about how we think about sovereignty, and then hopefully open up a discussion about different ways of thinking about sovereignty and about responding to it critically. So first, Agamben. So Agamben, he argues in line with his argument in Homo Sacer and in other places, other works. He interprets the government measures against the coronavirus as the extension of what he calls the state of exception. So he says the corona pandemic was articulated as a crisis by governments as an excuse to introduce policies that shored up the sovereignty of the state. by articulating the corona crisis as a crisis, governments could extend the state of exception in such a way that all that matters is what he calls bare life, which he also uses the term zoe for that, the Greek term zoe, rather than any particular way of life. And the word there is bios, zoe and bios. And here the state of exception for Agamben is diametrically opposed to freedom. So we are left with he writes, a society that has no value other than survival, making it possible for governments to trade freedom for mere survival. Based on the fear of losing one's life, he writes, one can only support a tyranny, a monstrous leviathan with the sword drawn. So for Agamben, the anti-contagion measures are yet another episode in the unfolding of modernity, where each episode of modernity repeats the same schema: sovereignty against freedom, sovereignty or freedom. Agamben's analysis rests on an absolute distinction or set of absolute distinctions between sovereignty and freedom, between zoe and bios, and also on a distinction of modernity and the modern state, modernity from everything that came before modernity. His argument assumes this periodization where modern politics is something absolutely new, as if there were no biopolitics before modernity, as if there were only biopolitics today, and as if biopolitics were always the same. It also assumes an eschatological version of history that can only end in ever more totalitarian forms of sovereignty, at least as long as we stay within modernity, because there's no possibility of negotiating between Agamben's sovereignty and freedom. Indeed, Agamben concludes, as we saw in a quote before, that the control exercised by governments today is bigger than the control exercised by fascist states in the first half of the 20th century. Now, Agamben trades in absolutes, and there's no room for provisional interpretations that recognize their own finitude and provisionality. Once you have understood the logic of modernity, then everything else is just repetition without difference. Hence, also Agamben's critique of Derrida and of deconstruction as merely tinkering with metaphysical concepts in a way that is actually paralyzing. So with Derrida, Agamben argues, with Derrida we do not get anywhere, because Derrida stays within the confines of metaphysics, for instance, the modern paradigm of biopolitics. He cannot break with it. For Agamben, only an absolute break with the modern paradigm of biopolitics and an absolute break with sovereignty can bring us freedom. There's nothing to hope for within the practice of sovereignty. So now Derrida. So Derrida does not reject biopolitics as irrelevant. On the contrary, he says that biopolitics is an important characteristic of contemporary politics and social life. And he's writing this at the very end of the 90s, early 2000s. Nor does he accept the discourses of sovereignty as they are presented to us. He often talks about the phantasms of sovereignty, or sovereignism, which is a term that he uses in order to criticize this idea of an absolute sovereignty and of sovereignty as an either or. So on the contrary, he spent the last years of his life writing critically about sovereignty in different contexts. Rather, Derrida's argument is that erecting walls between zoe and bios, and between sovereignty and freedom, and between modernity and what came before modernity, erecting these walls itself takes part in the discourse of what he calls sovereignism. Questioning, like Derrida does, without simply rejecting the distinctions between sovereignty and freedom, and so on. This makes it possible for Derrida to differentiate between different forms of biopolitics, between different forms of sovereignty and so on, but also between different forms of freedom, some of which might be better than others. The result of Agamben's oppositions between sovereignty and freedom, and between biopolitics and freedom, is to homogenize everything either side of the distinctions. So all sovereignty becomes the same, and all sovereignty becomes equally opposed to freedom in Agamben. The result of Derrida's deconstruction of the distinctions is to differentiate within this homogeneity of either sovereignty on one side or the homogeneity of freedom, which all look the same on the other side. The distinctions don't disappear altogether, but they become part of what I would call a general differentiation. A general differentiation among discourses and phenomena where the differentiation cannot be reduced to a particular concept. For instance, the concept of bare life or sovereignty or the state of exception, as in Agamben, or be reduced to a conceptual distinction. So a bias or sovereignty freedom, again, as in Agamben. So only by rejecting Agamben's wall between sovereignty and freedom and between biopolitics and freedom does it become possible to differentiate between otherwise homogeneous cases, say between the UK and Ireland, or between England and Scotland, or between Denmark and Sweden. Only by accepting this kind of differentiation can one start asking if a democratic and progressive or left biopolitics and a democratic sovereignty if these are possible, and what they would look like. And I don't have an answer to what they would look like, but at least this deconstructive move makes this kind of question possible. Now, given Agamben's critique of the modern state, the only solution for him is an end to the state and to sovereignty. Not only is this space beyond sovereignty, beyond the state, and beyond exclusion unavailable, I would argue, but with Derrida, but it also means that Agamben cannot differentiate between different states, between different exercises of sovereignty. States limit our freedom to walk about and to meet with others, but states can, that is not necessarily, but may direct resources to help those who would not otherwise make it on their own. So it's a question of choosing the lesser evil. And we may add that it's not just a matter of calculating the lesser sovereignty, because the relation between sovereignty and freedom is both a negative one. It's both a zero-sum game and a positive one, let's say a kind of plus-sum game. And it's difficult, if not impossible, to calculate this relationship between sovereignty and freedom. It's a relationship between sovereignty and freedom that we have to, in quote unquote, negotiate. So I would now like to say a bit more about how Derrida goes about this deconstruction of sovereignty discourse, and here I'll be relatively brief, and it will be as schematic as I can be, as one can be with Derrida. So for Derrida, first of all, and very importantly, sovereignty is always both unconditional and conditional. Sovereignty is always unconditional in the sense of, the usual sense, we talk about sovereignty in IR, for instance, as indivisible, as absolute. It's sovereignty. There's no sovereignty that can be dependent on something else. The sovereign is someone or something, some institution or whatever that does not depend on other forces. So it's necessarily unconditional in this sense. But sovereignty is always also conditional, because it has to be declared, it has to be represented, it has to be recognized, sovereignty has to be represented by displays of power, for instance, or through law, or through the exercise of police force, whatever, and it has to be recognized by others, even at the level of different sovereigns recognizing one another's sovereignty, which means that sovereignty is always, we say, disseminated in webs of meaning, of normativity and institutions. So sovereignty is always both unconditional and conditional, and hence it's never absolute. It's always relative in some sense. Now, Derrida then considers different alternatives to sovereignty, And here's perhaps important to note that when Derrida talks about sovereignty, or rather when he first starts writing about sovereignty in the late 90s, the sovereignty he has in mind is the sovereignty of the state or the nation state specifically. And then it's only gradually that he kind of moves out from nation state sovereignty. And one of the ways he does that is by considering other alternatives to sovereignty, specifically to nation state sovereignty. So we can think about these alternatives as sites or as spaces from which to take sovereignty to task, from which spaces in which to hold sovereignty responsible. So there are sites from which to respond to sovereignty, from which to criticize sovereignty. But he ends up concluding that in each case, these spaces, they also involve sovereignty in some form. So in fact, they are forms of counter sovereignty, if anything. They're not some beyond or some outside of sovereignty. And among the things he considers are the university in a couple of lectures, international law and human rights, and democracy. So very, very briefly on that. So in the case of the university, and here he takes philosophy to be exemplary of the university, because it's in philosophy that we find what he calls an unconditional right to question, including an unconditional right to question sovereignty, the sovereignty of the nation state, or to question the state and all its power. So he associates philosophy and more broadly the university with this idea of unconditional questioning. Only to note then that in fact this unconditionality on the part of the university, of what goes on within the university, at least when it's as it should be, this unconditionality is in fact shared with sovereignty, which is also necessarily unconditional. And what's more, in the case of the university as a space has to be protected against other forces. It has to be independent, sovereign in some sense, in order not to be subject to the whims of the market, in order not to be subject to the whims of any current government. And yet at the same time, the university might draw on state support in search of this independence, in order to secure this independence. So the university as a space, and even philosophy, is itself not a space outside or sovereignty as such. There is something that we can identify as something like sovereignty, not necessarily state sovereignty, but some idea of sovereignty that is important to and constitutive of the university. Likewise with cosmopolitanism, international law, and human rights, Derrida notes that yes, this might be, of course, a space from which we can criticize what nation states are doing and what nation states are doing in the name of their sovereignty. But these institutions, international law and the United Nations and so on, they are themselves made up of sovereign states. And when we talk about human rights discourse draws on a sense of the human being as sovereign and as inviolable. So there too we find a certain idea of sovereignty as place, but it's an idea of sovereignty that we can turn against state sovereignty or nation state sovereignty. And finally, also with democracy, of course, when we talk about democracy, we also talk about not only, but we also talk about popular sovereignty. The sovereign, we talk about a demos that is supposed to be or supposedly sovereign, so that the will of the people might rule. So again, there we have a sense of sovereignty, here the sovereignty of a people, or popular sovereignty, which we might distinguish from the sovereignty of the state, of the nation state, but which is nonetheless partakes in a certain discourse of sovereignty. And what's more, the whole idea of the popular sovereignty and the demos assumes a certain identity to the people or unity of the people, and so a certain homogeneity of the people, which is also important in this context. So let me try and conclude. So with Derrida, I've tried to argue that sovereignty is always both unconditional and conditional, which means that it's never absolute. That might be a good thing, but what's more, there's no beyond sovereignty, as it were, which Agamben would have. So there's no space in which we can escape all forms of sovereignty. That's not necessarily then a problem, because it may be that sovereignty, or what Derrida here calls the ideology of sovereignty, that it may have provisional emancipatory effects. I'd like to end with this long quote that you have on the slide from Derrida, and also make some comments about this by way of conclusion. So he writes here about sovereignty, and about how to respond to sovereignty. He writes that it cannot be a matter under the pretext of deconstruction, of deconstructing sovereignty, of purely and simply frontally opposing sovereignty. That is the deconstruction, and he also talks about a deconstructive critique of sovereignty, cannot be simply a matter of opposing sovereignty simply frontally. It may also be a matter of opposing sovereignty in certain forms, in certain cases, but it's not simply a matter of drawing a line between sovereignty on one side and on the other side, deconstruction and critique, and for him also freedom. So, and the reason for that, he continues, is that there is no sovereignty, and he capitalizes this. There's no sovereignty as such, and there's no one sovereignty that we can oppose in this way. There's no sovereignty or the sovereign. The sovereign is never, again, a kind of homogeneous unity. Instead, they are different and sometimes, but only sometimes antagonistic forms of sovereignty. So there are different forms of sovereignty which we might sometimes articulate as antagonistic, as opposed, but not always. And it's always, he continues, in the name of one sovereignty, in the name of one idea of sovereignty, the sovereign individual, for instance, that one attacks another, the sovereignty of the nation state, let's say. Even, he continues, even in politics. And I think this even that he adds here, I think this is because when he starts talking about sovereignty, he starts from this idea that sovereignty, when we talk about sovereignty, then it's the sovereignty of the nation state. And so it has to do with politics. So I think that is the reason for this even. Even in politics, the choice is not between sovereignty and non-sovereignty. It's rather between different sovereignties, because that non-sovereignty is never an option in the first place. So, but among several forms of partings, partitions, divisions, conditions that come to broach a sovereignty that is always supposed to be, we might think that sovereignty is indivisible and unconditional, but in fact, there are all these partitions, divisions, and conditions that mean that sovereignty is, in fact, also always divisible and conditional. Now, of course, to conclude that all we have left is tinkering in this way with sovereignty is bound to disappoint those who, like Agamben, believe that there's no freedom this side of sovereignty. So for Agamben, sovereignty is intrinsically connected to the modern state, with which we can only have a relationship of dependence, a relationship that negates freedom. Agamben, we could say Agamben's politics is one of overcoming sovereignty, of moving beyond sovereignty. He talks about a community to come, a coming community. This is Agamben, and a coming politics. Derrida, on the other hand, Derrida's politics is one of living with or living on with sovereignty. so I will end there, and just leave it as an open question about how to, in the context of COVID-19 and the pandemic and everything that's going on at the moment, of how to translate that idea of sovereignty as always both unconditional and conditional, and as ubiquitous in this Derridian sense, how to translate that into particular political interventions. Thanks very much. Okay.
Thank you so much, Lasse, for a fascinating talk. Lots to think about as ever. We do have a question in the Q&A already, so if we can kick off with that. So I'll just read that and get that published. How does the individualization of responsibility from the state and the individual performances of sovereignty, of good citizenship, speak to your analysis?
I think that's a very good question, because so what I see happening is that from the side of the government, there is this call for precisely for individuals to act responsibly, which also means that if things don't work out, then we know who to blame. It's those individuals. It's not the government. Now, in some cases, at least I see this in Denmark, but I think also in other places, the unit that we have been talking about during this last year, when we talk, for instance, about self-isolation, that unit, that self, it's the individual. It's the individual who gets sick and has to self-isolate. But at the same time, there's also the family or the family home as a unit. Now, I don't think this speaks directly to your question, but it's interesting how it's interesting to note the kind of the selves that we have been talking about during this past year. So maybe there's a self of the nation, which we close our borders. This is us. This is we are in the same boat, and so on. There's that, and then there are the families, where family is someone who lives in the same household, but there's a kind of image of an ideal family in the background, and then there's the individual. But more directly to your question, I think this is that kind of individualization of responsibility, which we sometimes get from government, but you can also find it in certain critical discourses or discourses critical of the government, that simply opposes the individual. It's me, it's about me, it's about my freedom to walk around in the way that I want, to go have a beer when I want, to go to the cafe when I want, and to hug people when I want, and so on and so forth. These discourses that put this individual in the middle, I do think that they limit what you can do politically, and I'm not saying I'm not simply rejecting them, because there's also there's something good about individual freedom that I don't want to throw away with the bathwater, so to speak, but there's also a sense in which that individualization of responsibility, this image of the sovereign individual, or responsible individual, in which that might limit how we can formulate political critique and political projects that are different from both different from a kind of liberalist individualism, but also different from at least some of what governments have been doing, and it's very difficult to I think in this situation that we're in, I find it very difficult to think about the kind of political projects, the kinds of being together that would be, on the one hand, responsible, because we also want to be responsible. We don't want to expose members of our society to death and to illness, but at the same time being together that can also can also be about freedom. Yeah, thanks.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that question and that answer. Do keep your questions and answers coming in via the Q&A format. I guess whilst we're waiting for more comments, Lasse, something that struck me as you spoke is thinking about COVID in Britain and the response. It's been interesting to see that, you know, we have a Conservative government at present who traditionally, you know, the politics there is kind of very hands-off and individualist, and yet here we are in the third lockdown, you know, having centrally dictated policies and advice and things that we all ought to follow. And what's interesting to me is that we now have people who you could argue are expressing their individual sovereignty, as you discussed, in contravention to state sovereignty by going to like anti-mask rallies and anti-lockdown rallies, and the battle there, because you almost have you could almost call it like a sort of an anarchist movement here, in terms of these people trying to, you know, against the science, express their individual sovereignty versus the state. So I think that's very interesting, and also how this has all happened at a time of crisis, where traditionally we know power players have taken advantage of crisis situations to achieve things that maybe would be less publicly popular or would never get through during other times. So I think all of that, more of a commentary than a question, but really interesting to think about based on your talk today.
Yeah, and so that reminds me of something that we've seen here during the last, it must be about half year, that there's this group called Men in Black, who organize, they organize parties, but they organize them as political demonstrations, political events, which means that they can do it, they're allowed to do it as long as they keep 2 meters distance or whatever it is at the moment. So they organize these parties. So they make a demonstration from close to where I live here and up to the town hall square, and then they have this big party. And it's a very strange phenomenon or group of people, because you have the sort of usual suspects of kind of right-wing nutters, I would say. This kind of the sort of Trumpist individuals, but you also have groups of, I would say, basically anarchists who come from very different politics. So it's a very interesting phenomenon, but at the same time very, at least here, very marginal, very peripheral. So it has not gone mainstream at all. But still it's there. What you said also reminded me maybe to point out one thing, which is that so in Denmark during the whole pandemic, we have had a social democratic government, and that probably means something for how the left, both organizations outside parliament, but also the parties in parliament, how they have related to the government. Although I still think their lack of a critical stance vis-a-vis the government is still significant, despite the fact that they would be criticizing sort of one of their own because they support the government. And I think part of what you see on the left or center left in countries like the UK and also the US up until recently, the way in which the left and the center left have reacted to what the governments there were doing, it's also partly because of an animosity, a sound animosity, I think, towards the current governments there, for the Tories in the UK and in the US, the Trump administration. There's something that it would be difficult to certainly in the US to be on the left and then go out and say that, well, actually Trump is doing really well. He's got it right. At least you might formulate it in a different way. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So interesting to think about. We actually have a fascinating point that's come in via the Q&A. Somebody's saying here, I think the mutual aid groups that have sprung up can also be thought of as anarchist organizing. So really interesting point. Anything to feed up, follow up on that?
No, but yes, that might be a way of thinking about a way of being together. Which is not premised on a liberal, I wouldn't say liberal individualism, but on an individualism, on an idea of the sovereign individual as someone who is opposed to others or distinct from others, but instead a kind of a different way of thinking about freedom, that where my freedom depends on me doing something together with others.
Yeah, and I think there's something in that too, that anything that falls outside of the government response is potentially an anarchist response, whether it's almost like people taking it upon themselves to go further than the government measures, or people doing precisely the opposite. So yeah, definitely interesting to think on. We are coming up to the end of the hour, so if there are any last minute questions or comments, do send those in. But I noticed, Lasse, when you began your talk, you mentioned that this was based on a chapter that you're currently writing, or you have written. The book that chapter belongs to, is that currently in press? Is it out and available to buy? Where can we expect to get that?
I wish. No, I'm writing on it. That will in a year or two, probably more, rather two than 1 year. It'll be done and out. Yeah. But the idea is to do also with other concepts, and I'm doing with the other concepts, to do a bit like what I try to do here, that to use Derrida, or show how Derrida and other deconstructivists, if we might call them that, how they take a concept and quote unquote deconstruct it, or at least deconstruct discourses about that concept, or discourses where that concept is at work, and how that might open up possibility for thinking in different ways about that concept, and therefore facilitate different ways of political action. That's the basic idea, you could say. Yeah.
Great. Well, you heard it here first, folks. I'm sure that's the essence of the blurb that we'll get on that book, but something to look forward to for sure. I think it just remains for me to thank you ever so much, Lasse, for joining us today, for giving your time and your insights. To all of our audience members, thank you ever so much for being here. A quick plug, we do have an event taking place next Wednesday. It's a COVID research event that will be showing the research of colleagues at the Loughborough University Centre for Research in Communication and Culture. I think more information about that can be found on the CRCC website, and possibly we might be able to put a link in the Q&A as well for anyone who's interested. But for now, thank you again, Lasse, ever so much. I know you mentioned if people have questions, queries or comments, things they want to follow up with, you happily receive emails, and I think your email address is on your institutional page for Queen Mary's, so that's easy to find. But again, thank you all. Thanks for attending. Thank you to Lasse, and I think we'll end there.
Thanks very much. Thanks, everyone.